Ethics is a study of moral principle and values. But how do we know what is good and bad? How do we know what is right and wrong? Is it purely subjective or can it be based on objective grounds? And if so, what is the purpose of ethics? This video is going to attempt to establish an objective purpose of ethics by exploring philosophy, science, and biological imperative. 1. Objective ethics based on biological imperative. Ethics have an objective purpose founded on evolutionary patterns. But before that, we need to first establish the definition of what objective is. Based on more of a pragmatic and scientific definition, objective is a pattern that we observe and consider as consistent and exists or operates regardless of individual perspective or beliefs. An example would be gravity, which exists regardless of personal beliefs and is consistent enough for us to consider it as a law of universe. That is to say that it is an inevitable pattern. The question now is there such a pattern in our morality and in our behavior that leads to an objective ethics? I think we can find some insight by exploring biological imperative. So by observing the pattern of evolution, we see that all our biological traits and psychological behavior have, or at least had, a purpose, which is to sustain survival. But more appropriately, it is about continuation of genetics. All life forms that had a strong desire to survive survived. Thus, all life form require behaviors or traits that promotes the continuation of its genetics. And if there were ever a biological organism, an alien, that does not have the traits or psychological behavior that pushes them to survive under their condition, then their genetics would not continue, then they would not exist. That is the biological imperative discovered by Lester Frankfurt. It is the innate drive, such as survival, reproduction, and social bonding, that have evolved in organisms to ensure the continuation of their genes. This pattern is consistent in all biological organisms and is independent of any form of personal beliefs or personal biases, and that is an objective fact. I believe this provides objective grounds for ethics, and through this, we can redefine ethics as the study to maximize the sustainable continuation of genetics. Through the process of maximizing this goal, it naturally requires constant adaptation. It can be seen as a process of maximizing human flourishing and eudaimonia. So within ethics, terminologies such as good and bad, right and wrong, virtue and vice, moral and immoral are often created to help us categorize and develop an ethical system that attempts to balance and maximize individual and collective survival. We attempt to use logic and our moral intuition to establish a pragmatic and effective social norm and political law that promotes growth and survival. But despite our progress in ethics, we still disagree and debate about the definition of virtue and vice, good and bad. But by examining the biological imperative, we can find an unchanging pattern that establishes an objective ground which we can build our ethics and morality upon, helping us to further develop our definition of virtue and vice, good and bad. Through this, we can define virtue, the good, as traits or behaviors that promotes the sustainable continuation of genetics. It may be striving for actions that promotes well-being and harmony, while vice, the bad, are traits or behavior that hinders the continuation of genetics. It may be behavior that causes unnecessary harm or suffering. By establishing an objective purpose of ethics through the exploration of biological imperatives, it allows us to have a pragmatic ground to further develop ethical systems. Let's explore this idea further by examining our moral intuition and adaptation. Moral intuition. So, why is it that we instinctively feel some actions are simply wrong, while other actions are virtuous and right? Where did this our moral intuition come from? Our moral intuition are deeply ingrained in our biology and DNA, shaped by the same force that drives our survival instinct. Like our perception of pleasure and pain, they evolved to ensure the survival of our genes. For instance, when we touch a hot stove, the pain warns us to not repeat such action again because burning our hands would jeopardize our chance of survival and the continuation of our genes. Similarly, we instinctively feel that murder is simply wrong and naturally feel disgusted to such an immoral behavior. This instinct can also be explained through evolution, where human groups and societies that condemned and punished harmful behaviors such as murder were more likely to survive and live harmoniously. So, over time, this condemnation became an intrinsic part of our moral instinct. The joy and the fulfillment we feel when we form bonds of trust and understanding can also be explained by evolution and natural selection. We can trace back to our days of hunter and gatherers. Having trustworthy hunting partners who will not run when a tiger attacks or who can effectively work and cooperate with each other will significantly increases the chance of survival. Forming this bond is emotionally rewarding because it is vital for survival. Richard Dawkins, a prominent evolutionary biologist and author of The Selfish Gene, explained how even altruistic and selfless behavior can arise from the selfish property of genes. Take parental care, for example. Parents often sacrifice resources, energies, and even safety to ensure the survival of their offspring. Birds, for instance, will fake injury to distract predators from their nests, putting themselves at risk to protect their young. As Dawkins has put it, parents are programmed to do whatever is necessary to keep their offspring alive because their offspring contains their genes. These evolutionary mechanisms shows that what appears to be selflessness can actually be a strategy to maximize genetic survival. Altruism does not oppose the theory of evolution. It is simply one of its natural outcomes. Our moral intuition strives from our nature, from our DNA. But what about our moral reasoning and our creation of ethical systems? Adaptation and the invention of ethical systems. Societal and ethical systems are also a product of evolution. It is a form of adaptation where we use logic and cooperation to create a functional society. In the words of Charles Darwin, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives, but the one that is most adapted to change, that live within the means available and work cooperatively against common threats. Humans have evolved and are equipped with the highest capacity for adaptation out of all other species. Robert Sapolsky, a professor at Stanford University specializing in biology, neurology, and neurosurgery, has stated that the prefrontal cortex is part of the human brain that is least constrained by genetic influence, thus freeing us from strict genetic determinism, allowing us to be shaped by our environment. The prefrontal cortex is the last part of the brain that is fully matures, typically not reaching its full development until mid-20s. This extension development period allows for greater environmental influence, enabling individuals to adapt, change, and evolve within their lifetime. This explains how our other half of our moral intuition are shaped by our environment. Our involved capacity for logical reasoning, pattern recognition, and creativity allowed us to further accelerate the process of evolution and adaptation. Within our lifetime, we have the ability to create a more practical ethical system through logic and recognizing the patterns of human nature and human behaviors. In Aristotle's book, Nicomachean Ethics, it stated that every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason is the good has rarely been declared to be that at which all things aim. Aristotle had an idea of what good is, but couldn't exactly point it out what it is that all things aim for. Now we know that all things, referring to biological organisms, aim to maximize the sustainable continuation of genes, which is actually very similar to Aristotle's conclusion of eudaimonia. Knowing the objective purpose of ethics and the inevitable law of nature, we should be able to build a strong ethical system based on logic and purpose. This also aligns with teachings of Stoicism, which emphasizes aligning one's action with reason, virtue, and the natural order of the universe. The conflict, emotion versus logic in ethical decision. Here is what utilitarianism misunderstands about the nature of good and bad. It is not what is pleasurable that is inherently good. Rather, what is good becomes pleasurable, and what is bad becomes painful through evolution. For instance, imagine someone experiencing pleasure by setting themselves on fire. Clearly, such genetic traits will not be passed down across generations. This highlights how behaviors that fails to contribute to survival or well-being are naturally removed. Immanuel Kant captured this idea clearly. He says, reason is not given to us for the sake of happiness, but for the sake of producing a will which is good in itself. Kant emphasized that morality arises not from feeling, but from universal principles. This tension between intuition and logic, the divide between what feels to be instinctively right and what is determined to be right through rational thought, that is at the heart of ethical conflicts. We can clearly see that our moral intuition served a purpose in ensuring genetic survival. But the question that we need to ask now is, are these instincts still fulfilling their purpose? The virtue gap, knowing versus doing. It is often the case that individual knows logically what is right and wrong, but lack the virtue to act upon it. Our behavior are shaped by the interaction of nature and nurture. For example, a student might logically know that studying for tomorrow's exam is the right thing to do. If he doesn't, he will suffer. Even so, the student chooses to play video games. In this case, the student doesn't have the virtue of discipline to do the right thing. A more common example would be the use of social media. Many of us know the detrimental effects of phone addiction due to the use of social media, but that does not stop us from using it. In many of these cases, our behavior is socialized by our environment, resulting in a behavior that are logically not beneficial and counterproductive for the well-being and survival of individuals. This highlights the importance of creating a positive environment for human flourishing. Humanity's obsolete instincts. This same dilemma of logic versus emotion applies to humanity as a whole. Because of the exponential advancement of technology and social structure, many of our natural instincts or moral intuition have become obsolete. These instincts, which were once crucial for survival, are now counterproductive to the further development of humanity and the pursuit of objective ethics. Take war, for example. In the modern world, war no longer serves the purpose of maximizing genetic continuity. Historically, war were fought over limited resources, an extension of behavior rooted in our hunter-gatherer ancestry. Back then, competition ensured survival. But now, with our ability to create sustainable production systems through science, logic, technology, and the global cooperation, the old justification for war are no longer valid. Instead, war has become a byproduct of outdated instinctual behavior encoded in our genetics. Psychological egoism, selfishness, tribalism, and modern nationalism fueled conflict that no longer serve a productive purpose. This instinct, which once united small groups for survival, now alienate and divided humanity as a whole, inciting meaningless and destructive conflicts. If we're unable to see past our behavior that are fundamentally counterproductive to the inevitable pattern of nature, it will only extend our own sufferings. Worst case scenario, our technological advancement outpaced our ethical progress, which will result in human extinction. It is like the idea of handling a nuclear launch button to a baby. With great power comes with great responsibility, but more accurately, with great power comes with greater need for greater virtue. But let's imagine, even if all life went extinct on Earth due to human technology, eventually in the history of universe, either on Earth or on some other planet, life will eventually happen again. They will have the same objective ethics as we do, which is to maximize the continuation of their genetics. They might also reach a technological point where we are at right now and perhaps surpass where we have ended. As a species, we have the ability to find and rise above our instincts that are no longer pragmatic. I believe through reason and collaboration, humanity can and will evolve and cultivate virtues that focuses on building systems that maximize flourishing and sustainability. Solution: shaping virtue through education and culture. We are shaped by the world around us, and in turn, help to shape the world, even if our role in shaping it is often unconscious. Our ethics are shaped by our environment, so the question is how can we build a society that cultivates virtuous behaviors? Robert Sapolsky suggests that the malleability of brain allows for culture shift between generations in creating more virtuous behaviors. This calls for the need to prioritize effective education, teaching critical thinking, and cultivating practical and sustainable virtues. Storytelling is also another powerful tool that we can use. We need to use logic, knowledge to find and cultivate more sustainable virtues aligning with objective ethics, striving to maximize sustainable continuation of genes, which will inevitably result in eudaimonia. One virtue that I can think of is empathy. To further the purpose of ethical progress, we need to eventually achieve globalization. Thus, logically, we need to cultivate greater empathy and understanding between cultures, reprogramming our natural psychological egoism and tribal instincts. So, what other virtues can you think of? Remember, ethics is a journey, not a destination. By understanding its roots, its role in our life, we can align our action with nature and the pattern based on science.